Hello, leaders of Sonoma State. How are we doing today? Very good. All right. So, I love the energy, actually. That's really awesome. So today we have John Kornfeld, Dr. John Kornfeld with us today, and he's going to speak to you guys. And so a little bit of background. He is from Los Angeles. Both of his parents are from Vienna, Austria. He got his MA in English from Princeton University, and then, his BA in English. Close enough, from Princeton, and then his MA from Sonoma State in education. He has been a K through 12 teacher, and then he was a professor of education here at Sonoma State for 15 years. And afterwards, he was the, excuse me one second. He was the associate vice president for undergraduate studies, and then now he's back teaching part-time in the School of Education. So please give a round of applause for Dr. John Kornfeld.
Also, you forgot to mention the PhD, not to brag, but you go through all those years, you want to, if you're going to be called doctor, you ought to have a PhD in front of it. Of course, my medical doctor says, hello, John, I'm Dr. So-and-so, and so then I say, well, I'm Dr. Kornfeld. It's really the only reason to get a PhD, so that you can call yourself doctor to your doctor. All right, so I heard you called just now future leaders. You know a little bit about me. I wanted to know, can you hear me in the back? I just need to know. Can you hear me? Okay. And you won't want to leave. You'll want to leave, stay to the very end, because you'll just be so excited to know how the story turns out. All right, so let me learn a little something about you first. I'm not checking my text messages. I'm starting the timer. How many of you currently consider yourselves to be leaders? Maybe half, a third of you. Good. How many of you want to be leaders on campus? How many of you are in this because you want to be leaders on campus? Okay, so some of you see yourselves as learning to become leaders between now and then. Good. How many of you want to be leaders in life? Wow. How many of you just really don't want to be leaders? It's really okay if I had been in that audience. This is my first confession to you before I start. If I had been in that audience now, I would not have raised my hand, because this is the truth about me, and that is that I'm trying to get this in a position so I can see and also see you. I never really wanted to be a leader. All through my life, I preferred to always stay in the background. My idea was just keep your head down, do your job, leave it to your bosses or your elders or those who are more knowledgeable than you to take care of things. Leadership, I recognized, was stressful. People were asking you questions that you're supposed to know the answer to, and they were looking to you for leadership, right? That was for older, wiser, stronger people than me. Now, last week, did Mo give the lecture last week? Okay, her lecture is fantastic. I didn't go to this one, but I've seen it before, and I think that one of the things that she says is that leadership is fun. And with all due respect to Mo, whom I love, I don't actually think that having people depend on me for wisdom or support is fun. It's scary, it's stressful, exciting and rewarding and potentially life-altering, yes. Fun, no. And for many years, I was in a leadership position here at Sonoma State. I'm a recovering administrator, right? And in that leadership position, I was scared all the time. Well, not really scared, that's not true. I was stressed. I felt the weight of responsibility, because that is one of the truths about leadership. So that's my first confession. You're not all leaving now saying you don't want to be leaders. Good. The second confession is that I actually have no idea what leadership is. And the more I try to figure out what it is, really the more confused, the less I understand it. So I'm here to share that confusion with you. So for the next 40 minutes, I'm going to try to cut it short so that you can get to your class. By the way, I teach a 1 o'clock class, so I get it. You students straggling in late is a little disruptive, but if they tell me they're coming from the GMC, I totally get it. So I'm going to tell you some stories. That's what I'm intending to do. These stories all happened to me, and they're all true, and they all involve elements of leadership. My hope is that the theme and ideas that I touch on today will show that leadership can be found in unexpected places and situations. When I think of leadership, when we think of leadership, we all tend to think of great and powerful people like Martin Luther King or George Washington, or maybe powerful people who were evil, like Adolf Hitler. But I hope that these stories will demonstrate that leadership is not just in those powerful people, it's everywhere. So my goal, as I said a minute ago, is to get you to share in my confusion, to get you to think deeply about what leadership is, and then to come away with less of an idea that you had than when you started. Because confusion is a necessary step towards making your understanding more complex, to really knowing what you're trying to find out, towards seeing things differently from the way you saw them before. So I believe your assignment for this week, you may have read it or you may be about to read it, has been chapter 2 of the textbook for this course. Now, I've read that chapter, and I gotta say, it's pretty complicated and not hugely useful in my humble opinion, but it does help you to realize that leadership is not necessarily an agreed upon concept, that there are many theories of leadership. The chapter takes you from the very simple to much more complex views of leadership. So for me, the most helpful part of this chapter for me was the list of the truths about leadership. I'm going to use these truths as a touchstone in this lecture. So I was hoping that the chapter would at least provide a simple definition of leadership that I might be able to use as a starting point. No, they spend 4 pages on it, and then at the end they kind of say, well, you know, what does it mean and what does it all matter anyway? So I decided to concoct my own kind of simple definition, but after I had concocted it, I went to a Chinese restaurant. This was just before the lecture that I gave a year ago, and I really did receive this, this fortune. And the fortune cookie says, a leader is a person you will follow to a place you wouldn't go to by yourself. Now, obviously they're speaking metaphorically, but you know, that's pretty good. And it's not that different from the definition that I came up with, which is getting others to think about stuff or believe stuff or to do stuff that they wouldn't necessarily do without the leader's influence. Now, stuff sounds a bit nebulous, I'm sure. When I was young, I thought it was simple. Stuff meant do whatever the leader wants. Who were the leaders that I was familiar with? They were people who had authority over me. My parents, my older brother who could beat me up, my teachers. Over the years, though, I've come to see that it's more complicated than that. Okay, anyway, let me get back to the definition. Think about stuff, believe stuff, or do stuff. Now, while pondering this definition of leadership, I realized that it mirrors what James Banks, who's an educational theorist, says that school teachers should try to do with their students, to get students to know, to care, and to act. Which brings me back to schools. You heard in my intro I've had a lot to do with schools. Did he say that I was a K-12 teacher for 16 years? Yeah. So, but as a professor of education, I studied schools as organizations, and I explored how these organizations function. So in this lecture, what I'm going to do is use my understanding about school organization to illustrate how my conception of leadership has evolved over the years from feeling fairly certain about it when I was a child and thought it was simple, to having no idea now that I've been a leader for many years. So those of you who are planning to be student leaders at SSU should gain some insight here, because K-12 schools like Sonoma State are large educational institutions, and in terms of their structure and organization, colleges aren't that different from K-12 schools. And for those of you who aren't planning to become teachers, I expect you'll be able to connect what I'm saying here to any relevant setting. Okay, so when I was a kid, a little kid, my view of leadership in schools was pretty simple. The teacher is the leader and the students have to follow. Now, I'm going to tell a little story about when I was in first grade that really was the first time I had an inkling that it might not be quite so simple. It took place, I was 6 years old, I was in first grade, and it was in spring in Los Angeles. And I don't know what it was like at your school, but in my elementary school, even recess was pretty well regimented. You had to stay in your area at recess period, and the area was, your class was designated an area, and it would rotate around from day to day. Some days you could be on the kickball field, some days you played volleyball, tetherball, handball. The one that everybody hated and that I despised the most was caroms. You know what caroms is? Yeah, not too many people know. Well, it's like pool, right? You have a table and you have pockets and you have something that you hit into the pocket, but the table is only about this big. The cue stick is about this long. It's just a thin piece of wood. And the caroms are these flat little things about the size of checkers that sort of have a circle with a hole in the middle. And so you're doing this. You know, this is what you're doing. Now picture a 6-year-old who has been doing reading for an hour and a half and finally gets to be outside on a sunny day, and I'm, you know, waiting in line for 15 minutes so that I can go like this for 2 seconds. And I remember standing there in line and just feeling a lot of pent-up energy. Now, I can't really tell you what happened, but the next thing I knew, I was no longer in line. I was off, just running. I crossed the imaginary line, the boundary between where we were supposed to be and the wider field, and I just was running like crazy. I had the stick in my hand, sort of brandishing it like a samurai sword, screaming and yelling. And I hear screaming from behind me, and I look behind me, and there are 2 other boys, Tommy and Joey, who, there they are. They're brandishing their sticks and running like crazy. And we carom through each one of the different courts and play areas, and finally, we land at the 6th grade kickball game. And you know, kickball is like baseball, only you roll the ball and the batter kicks it. And so I got tangled up in the pitched ball and ended up flat on my face. And the next thing I knew, there were 2 6th grade bodies on top of me, pummeling me and yelling at me for ruining their game. And I hear one of them saying, "Get the yard duty, get the yard duty." Now, the yard duties were like the biggest, meanest 6th graders in the school, and they, they had a big sash across their chest that said yard duty. And they come up and sort of pull me up, 12-year-old compared to a 6-year-old, like a rag doll. They pull me up and shake me, and they take the 3 of us and sit us down on the bench and say, "Who's your teacher? We're going to get your teacher." And I said, "It's Mrs. Royce." And they said, "Oh, Mrs. Royce, you are in big trouble." Because everybody knew Mrs. Royce. She was my teacher, and she was the most terrifying human on the planet. I'm not sure she was human, because she was like 8 feet tall, and she had like 1 eye in the center of her forehead. Not really, but to a 6-year-old, she was just, I met her later on as an adult, and she came up to about here on me, so she wasn't really that big, but she was scary. And she comes over and takes one look at it, says, "What were you doing?" And we said, "Running on the playground." And she just says, "You sit there, and then when the bell rings, you walk into class and you stand in front of the class." Okay, so we did that. We walked into the class, and the class all sits down, and they all know we're in trouble. And then she just proceeds to just yell and scream at us and ream us out. And I have to tell you, I never looked up. I was staring at my shoes, and I really couldn't tell you what she said until, and this is what I remember, she said, "All right then, do you want me to just go into the cupboard and tear up your portfolio? Just tear it all up, everything in it?" That's when I looked up, because even as a 6-year-old, I remember thinking, wow, what does my portfolio, that's like it was open house was coming up, and that's where all your best stuff is displayed. And I remember thinking, what does this have to do with running on the playground? But of course I didn't say anything. We just said, no, please don't tear up our portfolio. She said, "All right then, are you going to behave from now on the playground?" Yes. Okay, then sit down. And that's all that I remember. That's the end of that little story. Years of psychiatry have cured me, so don't worry, I'm okay. But let me ask you a question, though. In light of the definition of leadership that I just gave a second ago, getting people to do stuff, think about stuff that they wouldn't ordinarily do, who are the leaders in that story? Anybody want to shout out? Are there who you see as being leaders in that story? Well, let me ask. Yes.
You were a leader.
How was I a leader? That's an interesting idea.
Was that the first person to run around with the cue in your hand, and 2 other of your fellow classmates decided to follow you?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I don't disagree with you, and yet it was not on my mind to bring others along, and yet somehow I was an unwitting leader. Good, so there's an example of a leader in that story. What else? What other leaders in that story? Yes? The yard duty, another interest, because they were the ones who were making me sit down and got the teacher. And that's really interesting because, yes, they're leaders. I can't believe somebody is calling me. They're the leaders, but they're also following rules, right? I mean, on the one hand, they're leading, but on the other hand, I'm only saying all this to indicate just how complicated leadership is. They were definitely getting me to do stuff, and yet they were just following orders, right? How about anybody else? Who's the obvious one? The teacher, she's obviously, ruler of the roost here, right? So, I mean, I have to say, I didn't really think a lot about it at the time, but just trying to see a clock somewhere. Do we have any clocks here? Okay, good, 12. As mature adults, we can see that leadership emanates from various sources. But as a child, I had no clue of what we just talked about, that I or any other student or anybody had exercised leadership. As far as I was concerned, it all came, as it does in this slide, from the teacher. But I did learn an essential truth about leadership, and that is that having a charismatic personality is not a prerequisite for leadership. Rule number 3. I gotta tell you, Mrs. Royce was mean, she was scary, she was all kinds of things, but charismatic, she wasn't. She didn't draw people because of her magnetic personality. Okay, well, in fact, 16 years later, at the tender age of 22, that was when I began as a new teacher at a school called Kent Place School. I was a 4th grade teacher. I still held the view that leadership in schools came from the teacher. Now, can you imagine the kind of pressure that put on me as a new teacher? I expected that I, as the all-powerful teacher, needed to be the ultimate leader. Of course, I felt like I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything. Which I'll talk about in a second. I mean, basically I thought the teacher was the leader, but I was aware that there was this sort of nebulous arena of administrators, people who seemed to be higher up than the teachers. In fact, it was an administrator who had hired me, a headmaster. He hired me because he had gone to Princeton, and that's the way that works. I had gone to Princeton, he had gone to Princeton. I was not the least bit qualified to be that teacher. So I went into that class teaching 4th grade with no idea what I was doing. I hadn't gone through a credential program. I had a BA in English. So, I seemed to do pretty well in that first job because the kids this was a sort of high socioeconomic school. The kids were well behaved. They knew what they were supposed to do. There was a textbook in every subject, and so I just followed the textbook, and everything seemed to be going okay until back to school night, which is what I'm going to tell you about next. So back to school night. At back to school night, that's right in the fall. That's where the teacher just goes through a litany of this is what I do, this is what we do in this subject, this is what we do in this subject. So I started off, I told them all about the math curriculum, and then I told them about the social studies curriculum. And when I got to reading, I was showing the reading book, and I started to talk about it when a hand went up in the back of the room. It was Mrs. Smith. So I said, yes. She said, excuse me, Mr. Kornfeld. I was 22 years old. I turned around to see if my dad was in the room. I didn't know. From Mr. Excuse me, Mr. Kornfeld, but can you tell us how many sight words the average 4th grader should know? I had no idea what a sight word was. I did not have any clue what she was talking about. And I'm up there in front of 2 parents for each kid. These are, show business executives in New York. They're bankers, they're lawyers, they're doctors, and I'm this guy in a cheap polyester suit. And I just stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then I said, well, I don't really believe we should quantify things like that. Sight words, it's really different for every student depending on their abilities and their needs. I did not fool one parent in that room. They knew that I had no idea what I was talking about. So I went on to the next. I continued to talk about reading. Another hand goes up. This parent is next to Mrs. Smith, and she says, excuse me, Mr. Kornfeld, but could you tell us why you're telling lies to our students? I had no idea what she was talking about. I stammered something about what do you mean? And she said, you told my daughter that if you want to lose weight, all you have to do is stand on top of a mountain. I had no idea what she was. So it could have been, just as easily been the moon is made of green cheese. I had no idea. Parenthetically, I went the next day to her daughter, Tracy, and I said, what was that about weight and the mountaintop? She said, remember when you read that story about mountain climbing? You said that if you walk, that when you go to the top of the mountain, you get thinner? And I said to her, no. Remember they were having trouble breathing. I was saying that the air gets thinner. I wish I had known that then. I didn't. I was back in the classroom. And this was not back to school night. This was a hazing. I got one question after another, after another, after another. That was more than 40 years ago, but if Mrs. Heidelberg hadn't come in, I would still be there answering questions. But I learned one important lesson as I was Mrs. Heidelberg comes in and she says, oh, excuse me, parents, I'm so sorry, but back to school night is over. You need to go downstairs and get milk and cookies. Thank goodness for old Agatha Heidelberg. And so as I was driving home pondering other professions I could go into or wondering if I would get the gumption to come the next day, I realized that I had learned one important thing about leadership, and that is that it's not just the teacher who's the leader. The parents certainly have something to do with it themselves. So, you know, Agatha Heidelberg, the next day I did drag myself into school, and there was a candy bar on my desk with a note on it, and it said, the first 100 years are the hardest. Don't worry about it, Agatha Heidelberg. And so I was very grateful, and I went into her classroom. She was the third grade teacher next door. And she said, don't worry about it. You know, Mrs. Smith, who asked you that, she knew every single thing that had happened in that room. I still don't know how she knew it. But she said, don't worry about this. Mrs. Smith, she applied for your job. You got the job. It was just sour grapes. It was a little bit about politics in the schools, but it didn't really help me at the time. But Agatha Heidelberg was often there to help me. She had a really interesting viewpoint about teaching in schools. She really believed she was really sweet to me most of the time, but she was a disciplinarian. She said to me, this is what you need to do. You need to have the kids in rows, and then you need to have your desk behind them, so they can't see if you're looking at them or not. And you can really watch them, and if they just turn their head one way or the other, you nail them right there. Like, whoa, this is not my idea about teaching, but I just nodded my head. And, but, you know, as I told you, I didn't know anything about teaching. And so I tried to follow what she had to say, but nothing was working. They weren't learning their multiplication tables, long division, anything. I could see that it was turning into a disaster, particularly in math. Because there would be long lines at my desk to answer questions when we were doing work in the class because nobody knew how to do anything and I wasn't teaching it well. And somehow I had this brilliant idea all by myself, which is not something that I thought up, but I felt I had thought it up, and that is, what if I have the students work together in groups? And what if I have sort of some of the better able kids with those who are struggling, and they can sort of work with each other and answer one another's questions. There won't be such a long line maybe at my desk. Maybe they'll be able to explain it to each other. And I implemented this idea, and it worked beautifully. They were understanding. There was just a hum around the classroom of activity. And on that first day, I was going from table to table, and sort of at one point I was kneeling, and I was sort of face to face with a group of students, when I heard a noise at the door, and the noise was a huge shout. Mrs. Heidelberg was at the door. She said, what's going on here? What do you think this is, a poker game? Everybody get back to your seats. Be quiet, face front. What's wrong with you? It was at that moment that I stood up. And she looked over at me and she said, oh, Mr. Kornfeld, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were in the room. Carry on, carry on. And she left. But I knew the message, I knew she wasn't shouting at the students to yell at them. She was yelling at me. She was saying to me, you better keep that class quiet or else. So I went back to keeping things quiet. And of course, one thing that I learned, of course, is that, you know, it's not just parents who seem to take on a leadership role, it's also other teachers. Now shortly thereafter, another teacher, Sarah Gordon, sought me out. She was sort of closer to my age, but not to, you know, now being Agatha Heidelberg's age, I can say that there's nothing wrong with being in your 60s, but This woman, Sarah Gordon, was in her late 20s, and she had been teaching for a few years, and she came to me after school and said, I hear you've been having a little bit of trouble with Agatha Heidelberg. I said, yeah, I just have to keep everything quiet. She said, look, this is what you do. Around here, you just got to keep under the radar. Keep your door closed and tell the students when they're going to work together, they need to use their 6-inch voices. 6-inch voices. Seemed like a pretty good idea. I tried it out. It worked. Sarah Gordon had helped me, and Mrs. Heidelberg didn't bother me again. Now, I tell the Sarah story because I don't want you to think that all of this is always negative. Other teachers who help to lead you can also be extremely positive, right? So now, just to further complicate this, what about the students? Anybody who's been in a classroom knows that students often take on a leadership role that may or may not be helpful. Often teachers notice the things that are less helpful, like when they talk or when they talk back to you, or the one time that they all decided to drop their textbooks at the same time, or misbehaved and so on. So just to sort of round it out, you also have students. It's not just the teacher exerting leadership on the students, you also have students exerting leadership on the teacher. So what does this show in terms of what I've learned about leadership at Kent Place School? I was there for 2 years. Well, one of them is that leadership occurs at all levels. I thought I'm supposed to be the one to be kind of in charge, but in fact, there was leadership happening from all sides. Okay. Now, I know you must be thinking right now, wait a minute. We seem to be straying from a concept of leadership. We're not talking about leadership anymore. What are we talking about? We're talking about power here. Clearly, I had thought that teachers held all the power. It's not about leadership. And I was gradually coming to see that power was a shared thing. It went back and forth. So you might be thinking that I'm confusing power and leadership. And am I? I don't know. Because they're not that different. I put up here a definition of power. Have any of you taken Social 201 with Dean Leader? She's wonderful, isn't she? And I've seen her give a lecture where she talks about power, and this is what she says: the ability to get people to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do. Now compare that to my definition of leadership. They're pretty similar. So really, we need to ask, what's the relationship between leadership and power? Power is mentioned several times in that chapter 2. And the idea that you must be empowered to be a leader. But where does the power come from? Power can be divided into 2 distinct types: personal and position power. Basically, position power is external to you. It is something that it is power that is conferred upon you by virtue of the position that you hold. Barack Obama was president of the United States until January 2017. And prior to that time, he had all kinds of powers, being able to pardon somebody, for instance, executive orders, things that he could do. But as soon as power shifted from him, he no longer has that ability to do it. So position power is power that can be taken away. Personal power is different. It's kind of more like who you are, what kinds of energy you exude that gets people to do these other things. So consider the power dynamics at Kent Place School. I was in the same position as Agatha Heidelberg. She and I were both teachers, yet she wielded far more personal power than I did. In fact, she had such great personal power that she far overshadowed anybody in the administration, and she wielded it to maintain her leadership and power. Sarah, on the other hand, also had power, but she used it to empower me to take charge of my own classroom. Very different. So power isn't necessarily top-down. You have intersecting realms of power that depend a lot on the personalities of the players. That's why it's so important that you find the power in you as you take on leadership roles. Okay, so I had learned a lot about even how I could exert my own personal power really by staying under the radar when I was at Kent Place School. So consider position and personal power and their connection to leadership when I tell the next short story of my teaching. So by the time I left and started in my job at Springdale, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute, I had a much more sophisticated view of leadership in the schools. So let me tell you about my first day and my first few months at Springdale to sort of paint a picture. Springdale School was a pretty laid-back place. I got the job in August, so I really didn't know any of the teachers. I'd been interviewed by the principal. I'd gotten the job. And so on that first day, I came in, and all the teachers were just hanging out on the playground. It was a sunny September day. And so I sat down with them, and the kids are all milling around as if they're waiting for something. And then along comes Mr. Jones. He's the principal. And he's got this huge sack like Santa Claus over his shoulder. And the kids all crowd around him. And he opens up the sack, and there's all kinds of sports equipment in there. And so he takes out a football, and he throws a long pass, perfect 40-yard bullet to an 8th grade boy, and they start a game almost right away. Throws another, shoots a perfect swish to the basketball court. A group of girls get together and they start a full court game. And it goes on. He passes out all of the balls and then just hangs out and watches. I see him commenting, sort of making suggestions. Remember, pass the ball. You're not the only player on the team. Teamwork, remember that. And everybody's having a good old time. The bell rings for the start of class. Nobody moves. I'm just sort of looking around, wondering what's going on. And I said to the other teachers, when do classes start? They said, well, you'll see. Well, when they started was when Mr. Jones said, okay, ball's in, and then it was like everything in reverse. The kids running, throwing the balls to him, they go in the sack, and away they go. Because Mr. Jones, he didn't care about anything but sports. That was his big thing. He loved it so much that he coached all of the 7th and 8th grade teams, which were basketball and flag football. Flag football, 6-man football, everybody's eligible. And in fact, I was teaching 8th grade, and so during the first week, I was asking the 8th graders about their team, and they said, come on out, watch a game. And so I went out and watched the game, and the team did really well against a rival school, but lost. But I noticed a few things around their special teams, about keeping the ball inside. So, I thought about what I learned about leadership at Kent Place, and I thought, okay, under the radar, right? So I had the 8th graders before lunch, and I said to the boys on the team, stick around, I'll show you a couple of things. And I did. I drew things on the board, and they looked at it and thanked me, and then they went out. And they played their next game. I went to their next game, and they won. And when I went up to a group of the boys to congratulate them, they said, well, we won thanks to you. Thanks. And I felt very proud. And from then on, whenever I noticed something, I would call them into the classroom at lunch, and we would spend a few minutes, and we'd look at it. And everything was fine. Now, Mr. Jones was so into sports that one day I noticed one of my students with a brand new pair of sneakers, like really the hottest, most, maybe last season's, but really a great pair of sneakers. And this, in contrast to Kent Place, was a very impoverished school. There's no way that kid could have afforded those sneakers. And I said to him, where'd you get them? And he said, oh, Mr. Jones gave them to me. Sure enough, it turned out that, Mr. Jones had a connection with a shoe guy, and within 2 weeks, every kid in the school was wearing sneakers. And he just gave them away to anybody who wanted them. And then I saw a couple teachers wearing sneakers, and more teachers. And finally, one day in the teacher's room, old Mrs. Miller was, 65 years old and chain smoker. And I'm thinking, this woman is never going to run a step in her life, right? She's wearing a pair of sneakers. And so I sort of announced to the whole teacher's room, sort of, gee, I wonder when Mr. Jones is going to give me a pair of sneakers. And everybody laughed. They laughed at me. And one teacher came and put her arm around me and said, John, you will never get a pair of sneakers from Mr. Jones. See, all these sad stories I'm telling you. But you know what it turned out was the reason? Because Mr. Jones knew what I was doing with those 8th grade boys. He knew. And what did I say before was his mantra? Was teamwork. For him, you do things together. If I had gone up to him and said, hey, can I help you out? Here are some things that he would have been more than happy. But no, I had gone completely around him. He knew it, and he wasn't going to say anything because that wasn't his way. The way he did it was by not giving me sneakers. And, various other little things that showed his disdain for me. See, teamwork was the culture at Springdale School. And I saw this happening, believe it or not, on yet another back-to-school night. Yes, my first back-to-school night at Springdale Elementary School, a K-8 school. Parents come in, and I've got my spiel ready, and even before I can say a word, a parent raises her hand. It's like, oh no, deja vu. And I call on her, and she says, how can I get my son to get all of his homework done? He never does his homework. And I thought, okay, what's the trick here? But before I can answer, another parent said, well, have you thought about taking the television? Does he have a TV in his room? Yes. Well, why don't you take the TV out of his room? Oh, good idea. And then another parent says, well, you know, my son claims he's starving. He eats for an hour before. And, you know, what started happening was this whole discussion about homework and how to help the kids. And, you know, they looked to me for answers, and I gave my opinions where it was warranted. But it was really much more of a free-for-all. You know, it was not a hazing. It was an encounter group, right? But it was... Think about what I said before. The idea was teamwork. The whole culture of that school was teamwork. Okay, so I became ever more understanding with the teamwork idea at Springdale School, and I began to realize everything goes in every which direction. Sure. The parents have some leadership over me, but they also expect me to be wise and provide them with some ideas as well. And students may have an influence about other teachers. I mean, I could just go on and on and on, but it just got more and more intertwined. So what are the truths about leadership that I discovered there at Springdale? Well, one of them is that there is no one identifiable right way to lead an organization or group. Leadership sort of happens at different places at different times. At that back-to-school night, the parents were really taking on leadership not to wrest power away from me, but because they wanted to share it. They were handing it back and forth. They looked for wisdom wherever they could find it. Similarly, Mr. Jones would have been very happy to work with me and to accept my ideas, but for me to sort of try to take it away from him, that was not acceptable. The other thing that I learned, and I haven't talked much about this, there's not a lot of time, you have to distinguish between leadership and management. You know, management is making sure that an organization works well. You know, if you're a student leader here, a lot of what you're going to do is just going to be to do all the things that you need to do. And, you know, Mr. Jones didn't do any of that. He was out there teaching to this day, and he was in his 60s then, 40 years ago, so he's long gone, but many of his students remain. And he was the most important person in their life. The lessons that they learned from him were life-altering, right? So he provided incredible leadership, and yet the school was falling apart. He was not in the office where he needed to be to make sure that we were paying bills that needed to get paid, overseeing what teachers were doing. I'm not even convinced that the way he managed me was all that good. It was the way things were. But so he sort of fell down on the management. On the other hand, I can tell you as an administrator here at Sonoma State, the easiest thing in the world is just manage, and never take on ideas and leadership that will really get people to a new place. So you need to distinguish, and as leaders, you're going to need to do both. Okay. When you look at this slide, comparing my 6-year-old understanding of leadership to my current view, you can see that my evolving vision of leadership mirrors the increasingly complex understanding that you read about in your book. Maybe a true leader is someone who can harness all that energy from all those different constituencies, make sense of them, make sense of the chaos, and help people to continually improve what they do for students. Clearly, truth number 4, that there's not one identifiable way to lead an organization, is key. Leadership at Kent Place School looked very different than it did at Springdale. At Kent Place School, as I said before, I had to stay under the radar in order to help my students effectively, in order to lead them effectively. Whereas at Springdale, staying under the radar was destructive to my status and to the organization as a whole. I was modeling bad leadership at Springdale by using the same kind of leadership that I had used at Kent Place School. I was undermining the most popular leader at the school. So consider the differences between Springdale and Kent Place. It's the same generic organizational structure, and yet they were such different places. As I said before, being a leader in one place required very different strategies and interactions and efforts than the other. So what do you do when you are new to an organization? Think about it. You're going to be leaders. Some of you may be leaders for the same class, like FYE, but you'll have different instructors. And those different instructors may have very different styles, and you need to figure that out. So when you're new to an organization or to a club or anything like that, whether it's school or someplace else, the first thing you do is nothing. Nothing at all. And you manage, right? But you watch. You do what you're told, and you ask questions, but you take no sides. You learn how things work. One administrator here at Sonoma State called it kicking the tires. You spend some time kicking the tires, learning the culture before you, I've seen principals who came in and said, okay, I'm going to change something big here. They didn't last because the school culture could not handle that degree of change. Okay, to return to what I said at the beginning of the lecture, I still don't know exactly what leadership is, but every day I think I understand it better. Now, there are still two more truths that I haven't touched on, and I wanted to spend a minute. As for the idea that leaders are born, not made, consider my own professional trajectory, what I told you about. I started out as an elementary school teacher, and then in the end I was an administrator here at Sonoma State. See, initially I saw myself as only responsible to get the job done. Then people started asking me for more. My principal, when I was a teacher, signed me up to lead a teacher workshop. She didn't even ask, she signed me up. She said I was an expert in teaching history and should share my knowledge with others. I'd never thought about that before. Then, when here at Sonoma State, my dean suggested that I teach in FYE. Then my colleagues in FYE asked me to coordinate FYE. Gradually, I found myself taking on more and more responsibility. You look around to other people for help and you realize, oh, people are looking to you for help. So, but it was that series of sort of moving up in the ladder that had me made, not born. And it makes me think of a very famous fictional character, and that is Harry Potter, right? Because that's exactly what happens to Harry. Not to compare myself to the savior of the wizarding world, but you remember in King's Cross Station, towards the end of the final book, spoiler alert, right? Dumbledore says to Harry, "It is a curious thing, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. Those who, like you, have leadership thrust upon them and take up the mantle because they must, and find to their own surprise that they wear it well." So it's a process. And now, finally, on to the last truth, that leadership is teachable. Well, that's really what this course, University 238, is all about. Clearly, you can't learn to be a leader simply by studying. But by studying it and applying it to real-life situations, I'm convinced, and all of your instructors are convinced, that it's possible. But as I've tried to show you today, it's a lifelong journey. You're going to have to let us know at the end of the semester and beyond if we were right. So it is 12 minutes to 1. Thank you very much.